Hello everyone. Before you click off this video, please hear me out for a minute. I figure there will be three different groups of people who watch this video. Ex-Mormons like myself, current members of the Mormon Church, and other people who are not a part of the church who know a varying degree about it. First, let me address the current members of the LDS Church. The goal and intention of this video is not to attack your faith. I write about media that impacts me, and Under the Banner of Heaven impacted me a lot. I will talk about things that will probably make you uncomfortable, and I will share my opinions on topics that you're probably going to disagree with. Please understand that the thing I want to focus on in this video is Andrew Garfield's character's journey. I think that the experiences that Under the Banner of Heaven depicts is very important for people to see. The reason why I bring all this up is because I want active LDS members to understand that while this video is definitely going to be critical of the church, the main focus is the character journey and the experiences that character goes through. I'm not making this video in bad faith, and I'm trying to make it an honest representation of all the subjects talked about. This video might be hard for you to watch, but I hope you do. To the ex-Mormons like myself, I think this video provides two purposes. First, if you haven't seen Under the Banner of Heaven, I think you're going to come away with a great show to watch. There will be spoilers in this video, but I don't think it affects the value you get when watching Under the Banner of Heaven. The clear standout quality in the show to me is the show's ability to showcase issues in the church and how it affects members and non-members alike. Under the Banner of Heaven is based on true events. The murders and the family the show follows are all real. Andrew Garfield's character, Jeb Pyrie, and his partner, Bill Taba, are not real people, and they're not the detectives that actually worked the case. These characters serve as great examples of the two different sides of Mormonism. We get to see how things affect Jeb Pyrie and his beliefs, and we get to see how things affect Bill Taba and his lack of beliefs. The second thing I think you'll get out of this video is a cathartic reminder of why you left. While I won't cover everything in this video, I will most definitely bring something up that helped push you out of the church. It will feel good to remember that you have legitimate and valid reasons for why you left. And finally, to those on the spectrum of Mormon knowledge, I think you'll find this video interesting. Some of the topics in this video are more niche church history facts that some members don't even know about. So if you've ever wanted someone to spill some ex-Mormon tea on the Mormon church, then you'll enjoy this video. Or maybe you like learning. Fucking nerd. Spiel over. Thanks for hearing me out. Let's get to the meat of the essay. FX is becoming one of my favorite networks. As a kid, AMC always seemed like this amazing channel with these incredible original shows. Now, as an adult, FX is quickly taking that spot. I've actually already done a video on an FX series, my Dave video. FX's Fargo spin-off is also really good. I've only seen the first season, but it was really well done. Honestly, there are quite a few FX series I plan to watch or do videos on. Well, one of FX's most recent projects is a 7-episode miniseries made for Hulu called Under the Banner of Heaven, starring Andrew Garfield. Not only was one of my favorite networks behind the show, but it was about a topic that was extremely personal to me and starring one of my favorite actors. I was always Team Andrew when it came to Spideys, even before No Way Home. The movies aren't perfect, but Andrew Garfield's Spidey is. Anyway, in Under the Banner of Heaven, Andrew Garfield plays a detective named Jeb Pyrie who gets assigned the Brenda Lafferty murder case. Throughout the show, we follow Brother Pyrie as he tries to investigate the murder case and catch the killers. The sad thing here is that Brenda Lafferty and her daughter were real people, as were their killers. The murders that the show follows are unfortunately real. The reasons the murders were committed are also sadly real. This is a true story. While parts are dramatized and the two main characters are inserted to help the viewer understand what's going on, the characters and story is real. This happened, and the factors that led to these murders still have impacts today to varying degrees. And while Brother Pyrie isn't a real person, the journey he goes through is very real. That's why I think Brother Pyrie is Andrew Garfield's most important role yet. So why don't we jump into it? Let's start off where we first meet Brother Pyrie. Episode 1. In Episode 1, Brother Pyrie is very much Mormon. Andrew Garfield does a fantastic job at acting Mormon. A lot of the moments portrayed are things any Mormon, former or current, can relate to. Jeb Pyrie is your typical LDS father until later that day when the murders happen. Brother Pyrie is clearly deeply disturbed by the crime scene. Anyone would be. A fucking baby was killed. Brother Pyrie correctly thinks that an absolute monster must have done this. Unfortunately, the truth behind what drove that monster to take such horrible actions is something Brother Pyrie never suspected. And that is the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, also known as the LDS Church. Episode 1 is set up and doesn't really discuss many of the exact reasons that the murder was committed because it's just the first episode. But I do want to talk about one vital point in this episode. At the crime scene, a man covered in blood approaches the crime scene and is quickly arrested. This is Alan Lafferty, Brenda's husband. In the interrogation room, Alan shares with Brother Pyrie that he no longer identifies with the church and the church had something to do with the murders. He also says that if Brother Pyrie has an issue with the murders that took place, then he isn't a good Mormon. And while this moment is probably dramatized, what Alan says here is arguably true. That statement I hope to explore alongside Brother Pyrie's journey because that statement plays a big role in his journey and to an extent a lot of other ex-Mormon journeys. While we all aren't closely related to a brutal murder like this, all members of the LDS Church support to one degree or another some backwards and damaging views. I'll provide arguments for that claim as we follow the rest of Brother Pyrie's journey. For now, let's give some context for the important moments left in episode 1. After learning some background on the Lafferty family and their history of being very faithful Mormons, the police are able to capture Robin Lafferty. He is arrested and brought in under suspicion of the murder, and that's where our mystery sits at the end of episode 1. Brother Pyrie is still very much a devout Mormon at the end of the episode. He isn't willing just to accept that his church could have pushed someone to murder a baby. He suspects Alan killed his wife, and a large reason why he believes that is because Alan left the church. However, Brother Pyrie's world is about to crumble. In each episode, there tends to be a focus on a different troubling aspect of the LDS Church. The concepts explored in each episode aren't limited to just that episode, but there usually is a clear focus. Episode 2 doesn't explore any bombshells when it comes to the church, but it does start the drip by exploring the misogyny that fills the church throughout. The misogyny is present throughout the series, but episode 2 does feel like that's its main focus. Episode 2 begins with Brother Pyrie's daughter's 8th birthday party. This is a huge deal in LDS circles because 8 is when you're baptized into the LDS Church. We will discuss baptism more later. Brother Pyrie isn't able to make it home to help his wife with the party because of the murder case, so he calls the Relief Society president to get her help. The Relief Society is an organization in the church that is only made up of women. One of the few good things that the LDS Church has in it is the focus on service. This is one of the Relief Society's focuses, so the ladies of the neighborhood head over to help out. Brother Pyrie carries on with his interrogations of Alan and Robin, and in some flashbacks learns some important information about the family dynamic. Alan's parents end up serving an LDS mission. This is pretty common with older members of the church after their kids have moved out. My grandparents even served one. Point is that the Lafferty parents are heading out, and before leaving, the mother speaks to Brenda about living up to her womanly duties. While the parents don't kill Brenda, they still have elements of what pushed her killers into killing her. In the LDS Church, it's expected that a woman will do a few things. First is have lots and lots of kids. Second is to cook and clean. And the third is that they'll listen to their husbands. It's also a pretty large contention point among all the brothers that Brenda is attending Brigham Young University and is pursuing a career in TV journalism. To explore why this would be an issue, let's look at a talk from one of the church leaders. In 1972, Harold B. Lee gave a talk titled "Maintain Your Place as a Woman." This talk would have been given in the same time period as the real-life Lafferty murders, so it's going to give a great look at what the church culture was like for women back then. In the beginning of the talk, Harold states that the point of his talk is to tell women of the church how to be true women. Legitimately, the next 2 paragraphs are Harold saying that you must have kids before 30. Now, a little later, Harold tries to play off the dripping misogyny that's in his talk by saying that some misinterpret a wife's duty in following her husband. But instead of clearing up this doctrine and stating that a husband and wife should be a partnership, he instead just says that a husband cannot command a wife to disobey God's laws. He then says, and I quote, "The good wife commandeth her husband in any equal matter by constantly obeying him." In the nature of time, I can't go over in detail all the issues I have with this talk, but a quick list of misogynistic stuff covered in this talk are anti-sex and low-key implies anti-contraception talk, claims that being a mother is a woman's most important role, and tells women to avoid modern living. And sure, there are positive elements in this talk, just like with the LDS Church. The point is that this talk in the church culture as a whole is bubbling with misogyny just under the surface. This talk was from 1972, but the church's doctrine around women has not changed, and in turn, neither has the culture. The pressures are still there. The most damaging piece of evidence against the church when it comes to misogyny are two things: the priesthood and temple marriage. In the church, all leadership holds something called the priesthood, which is just nothing because it's not real, but regardless, you must be given the priesthood, and in most cases what's called the Melchizedek priesthood, in order to hold most leadership positions in the LDS Church. The issue is that women aren't allowed to hold the priesthood, like, at all. So women are instantly disqualified from 99% of leadership roles. Unless it's in the Relief Society or primary is where they teach the young kids from 2 to 12, a woman can't hold any leadership positions. That is definitionally misogyny. In the same vein, Mormons have tiered heaven. In order to get what is essentially the S tier of heavens, you must be married in the temple. This affects both men and women into deeply pressuring them to only date other members of the church, because otherwise they will not go to S tier heaven. On top of that, if women don't marry a member of the church, then they miss out on most priesthood blessings. Again, those blessings aren't real because neither is the priesthood, but it's what Mormons are taught. Men can date outside of the church, and as long as they're following the commandments and going to church, they can still have the priesthood power. Women can't. Women in the church feel even more pressure to marry inside of the church because of this. I know members of the church will have a lot of issues with what I've said. I'm sure you're thinking something along the lines of course that talk is anti-sex, we believe sex is only for marriage and creating life. Well, try to look at things from a different lens. What if the church isn't true? Then what? Under that lens, I hope you can at least see the issues in one or two of the things I've mentioned. None of these are silver bullets that disprove the church, but they're all issues that lie within church doctrine and culture. While most people aren't driven to murder because of an independent woman in the church, many judge. Many women feel pain, and many women suffer because of these things to one degree or another. There are many LDS families that abuse their daughters and wives because of these standards, whether they know it or not. Many women are pushed into just becoming a stay-at-home mom because God said so. It's really interesting to me talking to female friends inside of the church and then outside of the church. Typically with my non-member female friends, they're all waiting till 25 to 30 to start a family, and a few don't even want a family. Yet with my LDS female friends, legitimately tons of them already have kids, and I'm 23. Married at 18, kids by 19 is a real ass thing in Utah and among members of the church. I can't help but wonder how many of the LDS female friends actually wanted that with their life, and how many of them would rather wait 5 to 10 years before starting their families. If you want to be a mom by 20, then amazing, live your life, but I personally didn't know what I wanted out of my life until I was able to fully detransition out of the church and I was able to finally understand who I really was. I know that some of my LDS friends are the same way. Kind of just going along with church pressures and not really living their life. That's not really explored in Under the Banner of Heaven, but it's a very real part when it comes to leaving the church. What is in Under the Banner of Heaven is the underlying misogyny we just discussed. Brenda being a strong woman really didn't make the Lafferty family very happy. It's not what gets her killed, but it most definitely played a role with some of the more insane parts of the LDS church that led to her death. Even if she wasn't murdered, Brenda would have faced constant backlash from her in-laws because of her desire to be a reporter, and that's just fucked up. After exploring that portion of the Lafferty family, the episode pretty much ends. Now, just a warning before we get into episode 3. I think this is the episode and the part of my video that will upset active LDS members the most. Not because of what I'm going to say, but because of the topic I'm going to cover and the focus of episode 3. And that topic is the LDS temple ceremonies. Members of the church are not supposed to talk about these ceremonies, and I'll express my opinion on why I believe that is later. But to members of the church, these ceremonies are very sacred and personal. So to any members of the church who are currently watching the video, I'm sorry for what I'm about to talk about, but it's pretty vital for discussing the story and the church as a whole. In episode 3, Brother Pyrie does more police work, and during that work, he learns some details about Brenda's temple wedding ceremony. She spoke during the ceremony, which is a big no-no. Many of the wives were upset with her for that, and to make matters worse, Brenda was asking questions and was expressing discomfort about the temple ceremony. That's pretty normal for LDS members their first time in the temple. Like I stated before, you're really not supposed to talk about it because it's supposedly sacred. Well, I believe the church didn't want the ceremonies talked about because they're really weird and culty. I started to leave right around the time you're supposed to go through the temple, so I barely avoided this weird and indoctrinating experience. So here's what happens. Currently, today, the ceremony involves going through a washing and anointing and then getting a new name that you're supposed to keep private. After this point, for the rest of your life, you're supposed to wear Mormon garments, the weird Mormon underwear as some of y'all might know it. Well, back in the day, there was another part in the ceremony that was removed in 1990. Before then, temple ceremonies involved a death oath. That's not hyperbole. In the ceremony, you make covenants to the church, and you still do today, but back in the day, you swore an oath that said death was the penalty for breaking the covenant. There was also a bunch of signs you had to perform that were also removed, and they were also pretty much one-for-one stolen from Freemasonry. Pretty sus there, Joe Smith. But yeah, the death oath that is performed in this ceremony played a role in Brenda's death due to the practice of blood atonement. Blood atonement is an old principle that, yes, used to be practiced in the Mormon faith. In fact, Joseph Smith, the one true prophet himself, taught this principle. Blood atonement is the idea that some sins are so unforgivable that the only way to save this person is to kill them in atonement for their sins. And this is the reason why Brenda was killed. Now, the Mormon faith does not practice blood atonement today. It hasn't been taught for a long time, but it was back in the day. A famous killing called the Mountain Meadows Massacre was performed by LDS pioneers, and blood atonement was used as justification for it. Some settlers were passing through Utah, and during this time there was a lot of talk about the US Army intervening in Utah because of the Mormon Church. So the LDS members were kind of on edge, but that doesn't even come close to justifying what they did. After surrounding the wagon crew and figuring out that it wasn't military, the LDS soldiers approached the wagon train and slaughtered almost everyone there, even the kids. About 130 people were murdered in cold blood that day because of Brigham Young's orders. Orders that he gave under the belief of blood atonement. I guess you could say he was like the first mass shooter. I understand that those events were long in the past and the church hasn't practiced or taught any blood atonement in over 100 years. Well, the church also teaches that prophets are God's mouthpiece and that they cannot preach wrong. Church members love to excuse clear issues with prophets by saying things like, they're human too. Like, yes, they are humans, possibly lizards, but the church presents doctrine as infallible and Joseph Smith's prophecies as scripture. Joseph Smith wrote a book called The Doctrine and Covenants that the church treats as revelations, just like they do with the Book of Mormon. It's very common to hear Mormons call the Book of Mormon the most true book. So with all this considered, why does Joseph Smith have multiple provably wrong false prophecies? Things like the Book of Abraham being completely made up. Then there's the Kinderhook plates, which are fake and were made to prove that Joe Smith was full of shit and he fell right for them. And why does the Book of Mormon have translating errors and copied Bible verses that were unique to Joseph Smith's copy of the Bible? Why does the church keep removing doctrine put in place by Joseph Smith? Things like polygamy, the death oath, and the claim that all Native Americans are the people referred to in the Book of Mormon. I know I just said a lot there, and you're gonna have to research the additional details on your own, because I could legitimately write a page on each of those. A great starting place is the CES Letter. The point of all that is to show that Jeb Pyrie is starting to realize that the church is hiding and changing things about their past and origin. Brother Pyrie learns that the church and his faith definitively led to the brutal murder of a mother and her baby. And that's kind of earth-shattering. Jeb asks his wife if they can put off their daughter's baptisms until he finishes the case because he's so shaken by what he's learned so far. His wife is really frustrated about this because she's worried about what people in the ward will think. Wow, this moment hit me. Mormons judge hard. You're supposed to leave on a mission at 18 as a man in the church, and well, when I didn't leave or get a call when I was 18, I had everyone on my ass about it. There are certain expectations in the church that while they're not technically necessary, you do get judged and looked at by a lot of members. This will come up again, but this is how episode 3 ends. Brother Pyrie is very confused and kind of stunned by everything going on. Episode 4 starts with a doozy. Brother Pyrie's mother mentions the little fact that Hitler is in Mormon heaven. Mormons perform baptisms for the dead, which is a practice where they get to baptize in proxy for dead people. This is because they believe that after death we go to the spirit world. Those who didn't have the faith in their earth life are sent to spirit prison, which is essentially purgatory. When someone is baptized in proxy for the dead, that person is given the opportunity to accept the Mormon faith in the spirit world and then move from spirit prison to spirit paradise, where they will stay until Judgment Day and then get sent to one of the tiers of heaven. People who get baptized when they're dead get the opportunity to get to S-tier heaven and become gods with their own planets and shit. So in short, Hitler was baptized after his death in an LDS temple, and so if the Mormon faith is true, then Hitler has every opportunity to become a god. Yikes. Not the point of episode 4, just a crazy fact about the LDS Church that is 100% true. The main focus of episode 4 is the practice of polygamy in the FLDS. Let's start with polygamy. This is fairly important when it comes to the LDS Church and Under the Banner of Heaven. Detective Pyrie learns that the Lafferty family started to practice polygamy, specifically a few of their sons, and specifically, Dan Lafferty. Dan is a major focus of the episodes in the series because, I'll just drop the bomb now, he is one of the killers. While the Lafferty family was always what you would call traditional, things went really far when the Lafferty parents left on their LDS mission. This left their sons in charge of the family business and to lead the family. Dan was among the sons chosen to help act as a kind of head of the family. LDS families tend to be pretty patriarchal. Like we discussed before, the Mormon Church has a lot of patriarchal tendencies and values. Among those is the idea that men run the household. The father is the priesthood holder and makes many decisions for the family in many LDS households. Now couple this with Dan's fascination with old church teachings. Dan keeps finding old teachings from Joseph Smith that his church seems to keep hidden. The church is extremely guilty when it comes to whitewashing Joe Smith and his history. For example, Joseph translated the golden plates into the Book of Mormon by placing a rock in a hat, sticking his face in, and then he would dictate words he read off the rock. The LDS Church doesn't deny this, yet a lot of church art depicting the translation process shows Joseph's reading from the golden plates directly, and that is not how he translated them. If he translated them at all. This video would be 8,000 years long if I went over everything weird and sus the LDS Church does when it comes to Joseph Smith. That's merely one example. Point is, Dan came across some writings that the church tried to keep under wraps about polygamy and similar things and took them to heart. Joseph Smith is a prophet after all. If God is telling Joseph to preach this doctrine, then it must be true. So Dan brings it up to his wife, and she is understandably upset about it. It's one thing to bring up to a partner that you want to practice polyamory and explore that side of yourself, but it's another just to tell your wife, hey, by the way, Joe Smith said I get more wives, so I'm gonna get more wives, okay? When Dan's wife brings up her discontent with his idea, Dan brings up the teachings that she's supposed to follow him under God. God commanded him to do this, so if she says no, then she's breaking her covenants with God. Dan then reminds her about the fucking death oath they take in the temple and straight up threatens her. Do you see how this is all building into one big, ugly picture? Well, it gets uglier. Guess who Dan wants to take as his first plural wife? His fucking stepdaughter. Although, to be fair, he's just following in Joseph's footsteps, right? It's what God wants. Joseph Smith did practice plural marriage. The church doesn't love to advertise that he did, but he did. The LDS Church does in fact admit that good old Joe had up to 40 wives. Some of these women were 14 when Joe married them. Oh, and he was 37. The church only removed the practice of polygamy in order to get the government off their backs, and it took like 3 prophets to end it. And again, if Joe was preaching this as doctrine, why did God change his mind? Well, technically, he didn't. It's still doctrine, just not practice right now. In S-tier heaven though, you better bet you can still have a whole ass harem of women. Now, I mentioned the FLDS a bit ago, and that's because also in this episode, Dan goes to visit them and to learn more about them. The FLDS is an offshoot of the LDS Church. They're Mormon in every way except they hold some fundamentalist beliefs. Things like plural marriage and an even stricter patriarchy reinforced inside. However, they're a different beast that would take a long time to fully explore. It is important to note that the FLDS are not a part of today's LDS Church, but they do come from the same source. While the FLDS, in my opinion, is far more abusive than normal Mormon households, both FLDS and LDS share similar threads and issues throughout. I used to work construction supply, and one company we sold to was an FLDS family, and it was always a little crazy when the customer brought his wives in with him. Point is, Dan got a lot of his knowledge of older practices from FLDS members. all of which are practices that the early Mormons followed. Making sure that he is following the old ways absolutely grips Dan, and he tries to get everyone in the family to follow the old ways, including Alan. Once learning about all of this and the things discussed before, it's clear that Mormon fundamentalism played a massive role in Brenda's murder. Detective Pyrie has a pretty huge moment and turning point after this. Up till now, they've been trying to keep the case under the radar because of the implications. The chief wants Detective Pyrie to give some vague reason for the murders, but Pyrie says fuck this shit and just says it. When asked, he drops the bomb that the murders were likely motivated by fundamentalist Mormonism. This is a pretty big moment because instead of protecting the church like he probably would have before, Pyrie has become very unsettled by everything he's learned and has decided that it's more important that people know the truth. It's genuinely a big character moment for him. Keep in mind, Brother Pyrie is very much LDS. He's just seen some of the cracks and he finds it important enough that others know about it. So episode 5 explores more church history stuff. Some of the Lafferty brothers have joined an organization called the School of the Prophets. They research old church teachings and things like that. There's some history there, but I really find it uninteresting and don't want to talk about it. What I want to talk about from episode 5 are the social standards that fill LDS communities. In episode 5, we learn that Dan gets excommunicated for his fundamental beliefs. Completely understandable. Well, in this episode, we learn who the second killer is, and he also gets excommunicated, except for beating his wife instead. The second killer is Ron Lafferty, one of the other brothers. He has a lot of daddy issues and helps kill Brenda and her baby. Ron, in my opinion, is a bit more complicated than Dan, but at the end of the day, they're both pieces of shit murderers. Ron's excommunication helps push him over the edge, and while the vast majority of Mormons will never be excommunicated, I do think it relates really well to the theme that is present throughout Under the Banner of Heaven, and that's the theme of cultural pressures. There are a lot of pressures as a member of the church, and while members of the church will argue that those are just God trying to guide you in the right direction, the reality is those pressures cause a lot of damage to people. Some of these pressures are to look or present a certain way, to be straight, to be the perfect member, to serve a mission, to never swear, avoid coffee, listen only to clean music, don't do anything fun on a Sunday, read your scriptures, don't masturbate. I could go on and on and on. The church has many standards, and while some, like don't murder, are pretty based, most are pointless and genuinely not needed to live a happy life. To members of the church. The issue with having this discussion with you is the reason why we believe differently on these standards. You believe in the church and their guidance, and that's the main reason you believe a lot of these things. Maybe you have a personal experience or two, like you personally feel better when you listen to clean music, but an experience like that is really what I'm talking about here. I just ask that you try to look at what I'm about to say with the perspective that the church might not be true. Take away the influence of church standards and you'll come to realize how much social engineering the church has performed on you. Let's take a few of the standards I listed. No coffee? What in the world is the reason for this? There is one scripture that says no hot drinks and that's it. No other reasoning. Coffee doesn't really have negative health effects unless you drink a lot of coffee. Coffee is way better for you than something like soda that Mormons drink plenty of. Your state has bars, my state has soda shops. I've spoken to members that have admitted to me plainly that this doctrine is silly and they just follow it on faith. What about swearing? Genuinely, why is it bad? Okay, it's vulgar and it makes your tummy upset when you hear it, but those are 100% social constructs. Swear words are just words that our society chose to be offensive. There's nothing inherently different when saying shit compared to saying dang. I used to panic when I heard swear words. The first time I swore, I whispered bitch and felt like shit for the next 2 days. That kind of reaction because of a fucking word is insane and ridiculous. Really, holy shit. I'm sorry if you're hurt by swear words. You need to grow the fuck up. What about Sundays? Why can't you go shopping or go to the movies or anything like that? Just because it's Jesus Day? Genuinely, this one has no other justification other than God. I'm aware I'm very frustrated right now because these standards and many others put insane, unneeded pressures on members. I'm going to get personal here. I was suicidal in high school and for a time afterwards because of the church. I was falling short in some standards of the church. Maybe I'd jerk off sometimes, or listen to a non-clean version of Thrift Shop, or maybe even I was just a few minutes late to church. Point is, all of these failures kept piling on my mental health. The idea of worthiness is huge in the LDS Church and can make you feel like a huge pile of shit. Thankfully, I started dating someone who showed me the other side of things outside of the church, and my life has only gotten better the further I distance myself from the LDS Church. I know I'm not alone in the church impacting mental health so much. Many missionaries get sent home for depression and suicidal thoughts. I'm pretty confident I would have taken my life if I served in an LDS mission. Utah has the 6th highest suicide rate, and I know that the LDS Church has a major role in that factor. The culture out here doesn't just affect members either. I've been lucky enough to have a lot of non-members in my life while still living in Utah, and they all share experiences with me that people judge them for not being a member. Some parents wouldn't let their kids play together because they're not members. I went to BYU, and I remember hearing my roommate one day say, "Oh, I'm nice to non-members. I would just rather avoid them though." Like, holy fucking shit! There is a really toxic element in the Mormon culture, and especially in Utah. I know many members that are willing to admit this. Now, I'll admit, this section has been a lot of me expressing my frustrations with the culture I grew up in, but it is important for Brother Pyrie and his journey. Elements of this culture are littered throughout and presented super well and under the banner of heaven. Detective Taba is constantly being judged for being a non-member, and in some cases for being Native American, but we'll get to that. Brother Pyrie is constantly facing backlash and pressure for having questions or even bringing up elements of church history. The best moment that illustrates the culture in this scene is where Brother Pyrie gets questioned at church about why he pushed his daughter's baptism back by a couple weeks. He didn't cancel it, just delayed it, and yet he has people in the ward and his bishop jumping down his ass about it. The moment seems dramatic with how concerned and upset the lady confronting them in this scene is, but this is 100% accurate. I know multiple people from my home ward that act just this way. While this isn't a huge focus of the show, it's in every single episode and just is kind of subtly there. Just like real life. I really like the way they approach this element of the Mormon culture. So, Pyrie learns some important things in episode 6. First, Ron is now pursuing fundamentalist beliefs and fully embracing polygamy. He also learns that the head of the School of Prophets, a man named Prophet Onias, has told Ron that he is God's chosen one to receive God's word. I mentioned before that the School of Prophets wanted the church to return to old church teachings. Well, some of those teachings are pretty racist. I also mentioned before that Detective Taba gets looks for being Native American. Well, he gets some outright racist comments too. People call him a Lamanite constantly. The Lamanite are a group of people in the Book of Mormon who are essentially the bad guys. They're sinners, so God curses them with a skin of blackness. I'm not fucking making that up. It's LDS doctrine that the Lamanites were cursed with dark skin because of their sins. So essentially, Mormon doctrine says white people are pure and not sinners, and anyone with dark skin is a sinner to a degree. I remember learning about this in 9th grade seminary. Seminary is an extra church school Mormons go to, by the way. My seminary teacher's kids were black, and I vividly remember him teaching the lesson on this subject. He was in absolute tears as he had to teach that sinners were cursed with dark skin. He spoke about his kids and his own personal struggles with this scripture verse, and his justification was just trust God. Like, this man is stricken with pain when it comes to this doctrine, and instead of confronting that fact, he just has to accept it and trust God. Absolutely insane. This teaching is absolutely fucked. I promise I'm not making it up. Just listen to this shit. If you want to read it for yourself, look it up. 2 Nephi chapter 5. It's verses 21 through 23. What I'm about to read to you is directly in the Book of Mormon. And he had causing the cursing to come upon them, yea, even a sore cursing, because of their iniquity. For behold, they had hardened their hearts against him, that they had become like unto a flint. Wherefore, as they were white and exceedingly fair and delightsome, that they might not be enticing unto my people, the Lord God did cause a skin of blackness to come upon them. And thus saith the Lord God, I will cause that they shall be loathsome unto thy people, save they shall repent of their iniquities. And cursed shall be thy seed of him that mixeth with their seed, for they shall be cursed even with the same cursing. And the Lord spake it, and it was done. I actually got a little nauseous while reading that. The church doesn't advertise this fucked teaching, but it's very much still in there. On top of that teaching, black men were not allowed to hold the priesthood until 1978. That is only 6 years before Brenda's murder. So yeah, that's the teaching the School of the Prophets want to return to. At this point in the show, Detective Pyrie has learned so much earth-shattering information and faced so much pushback from church leadership when it comes to looking into church history stuff that he finally breaks and reads some of the material. Specifically, he reads the Book of Old Teachings that Dan had. They have it in evidence, so Pyrie reads it. This is an insanely huge moment for his character. In the church, you're taught to avoid ex-Mormon or anti-Mormon material because it's corrupted and will bring you away from God. I went to BYU, and at BYU, you have to take LDS classes to graduate, so I took a church history class. This is where I was first exposed to what I think is personally the most impactful piece of ex-Mormon material for me. It's called the CES Letter. It's a letter of questions about a bunch of flaws and discrepancies inside of the church that, in my opinion, blatantly proves Joseph Smith, the Book of Mormon, and the church as a whole wrong. Now, I remember being filled with chills when my teacher mentioned this document. We were about to do big essays on church history topics, and he recommended we avoid the CES letter because it's very faith-shaking. I was terrified of that document. Then, about a year later, a buddy of mine brought it up to me again, and I was filled with fear. I opened the document on my phone, and I kept it open for almost a year because I couldn't get myself to read it. And when I finally managed to, it really shattered my world. The point of my story is to get across the point that LDS members are taught to fear material that's critical of the church, and it takes a lot of courage to finally look at it. And Pyrie has managed to do that. It really is a massive moment for him. Episode 7 has a lot of powerful moments. It depicts Dan and Ron killing Brenda and her daughter. It shows them apprehending the killers finally, and Detective Taba has some powerful moments as well. Yet, my favorite part is where Detective Pyrie ends up. In this episode, some important things happen to him. First, he talks to his wife about all of this and she threatens to leave him. She wants to raise her family in the church and she plans to do that. This is something I've never had to deal with, but it's a very real issue for church members. Like we discussed earlier, it's vital that members of the church marry within the faith. The fact that Detective Pyrie is even struggling with some of the church history he's learned is enough for his wife to threaten divorce. This is a very real part of church life. My parents were aghast when I told them I was dating a non-member. Even though I ended up breaking up with that person for religious reasons, I know that my family blames them a bit for me leaving the church. I remember going to my bishop at the time and asking for advice, and he told me to break up with them because they're a non-member. People in my life have no doubt had an impact on my spiritual journey, but at the end of the day, it was me who made the choice to listen and to leave. My point in bringing this up is just to show that this is a very real element of church life. If you're married in the church and have questions, bringing those up to your spouse is a very scary thing to do because of all the consequences that can come from that. Another moment I love is near the end of the episode. Pyrie and Taba are trying to locate the killers, and during their conversation, Andrew screams "fuck" to get Taba's attention. This conversation as a whole is a really great moment between the two characters, but Pyrie yelling "fuck" is the biggest deal here. We talked about swearing and the pressures around it before, so the fact that he swears and even goes with fuck is a big deal. This is a signifier that Pyrie is starting to question some of the other standards he's been taught his whole life. He's seen the cracks and is starting to see that a lot of the other pieces are also filled with cracks. It was great to see Pyrie go from scolding people when they swore around him to just yelling fuck. And then we have my favorite moment with Jeb Pyrie. After the case is closed and the murders are arrested, Pyrie goes home. He hugs his kids, kisses his wife, and then the family prays together. Here, Pyrie has a lot of flashes of things he's learned go through his mind, and he cries a little. And that's the end. So, why do I love it so much? Well, I love it because we don't really get to see where Pyrie's faith ends up. He clearly has questions and things to work through, but he hasn't left the church by any means. I do think he's on the path to leave the church personally, but we don't get to know. Most deconversion stories take years. Mine personally took almost 5. Deconversion stories are something that are deeply meaningful to ex-religious members because of how insanely personal, and in a lot of cases, how hard they can be. It's not something that happens over a couple weeks. What we get to see Pyrie go through is that first discovery that happens to many ex-Mormons. The LDS Church has many issues with it. I promise you we barely scratched the surface today. So when you first come across some of these disproving facts or controversial histories, it's really upsetting as a member and causes you a lot of internal grief and pain. That's what we see here in Pyrie. We don't get to see where his journey will go, but we do get to see all the pain and turmoil it puts in a member's life. It's honestly a really powerful representation. I love the way they present Pyre's journey. Now, most people won't investigate a high-profile murder filled with really controversial topics like Detective Pyre, but everything I talked about and everything else that I didn't talk about are still present in a regular Mormon's life. It's a bell curve, right? At the far end, you have Dan and Ron Lafferty, who absolutely embrace fundamentalist beliefs and drive them to murder. Obviously, members like that are extraordinarily rare, but there's issues that lie inside the middle of the bell curve as well. Here you have members who are really judgy because someone wore a sleeveless dress, or parents who don't accept their child's trans identity or sexual orientation, or dads who discourage their daughters from doing anything but being a mom. I could go on for days. While members of the church are typically very kind and caring, they all have some backwards views that are bubbling just beneath the surface, even if they don't realize it. I know personally a lady from my home neighborhood that is the nicest and kindest woman you'd ever meet. But since their child has come out as non-binary trans femme, I've seen some of the most vile shit ever posted on Facebook. Most church members have a quality or two like this. Maybe not as extreme as my example of transphobia, but all church members have a few standards that they do look down on people for. I'm sure if any members of the church are still watching, you're probably upset with what I said. I'll be honest, it was really hard for me to see this quality of the church when I was in it as well. My head was always clouded by the logic that this is God's church and it must be right, so my brain would always jump through whatever hoop I had to justify it. If you're honest with yourself, I know you can think of some members in your ward who fit this description. I've alluded to other topics I didn't cover in this video, and if you're interested in learning more, here's what I recommend. First, watch Under the Banner of Heaven if you haven't. I really did have to leave a lot out for time's sake. If you want a deeper look at what it looks like to detransition from the church, watch Mormon No More on Hulu. It's a documentary that follows a few different people and their journeys leaving the church. It's a really powerful doc that did make me cry a few times. If you want to do research, read the CES Letter. I'll put a link in the description, but it really is the best place to see a lot of the issues that lie in the church. If you want an LDS perspective on things, check out the church's gospel topic essays. These essays are the LDS church directly addressing some of their more controversial topics. Another LDS source is Fair Mormon. They're an apologist group that tries to defend against some of these claims, and they even have a section debunking Under the Banner of Heaven. Holy shit, that section is hilarious. I looked into Fair Mormon when I was leaving the church, and to be honest, I find their arguments absolutely shit. It's a lot of logical leaps and circular thinking in my opinion. But some LDS members credit them for saving their faith. A lot of arguments only work if you're working from the belief that the church is true. Honestly, that's what makes talking to a member of the church about this subject so hard. It's really, really hard to have a conversation when you have almost no common ground on the conversation at hand. Like I said, I find Fair Mormon to be a really shitty apologist group, but it really is the best LDS one out there. I'm really grateful that Under the Banner of Heaven exists. I really think it's going to help bring people out of the church because it does a great job at shining a light on some of its bigger issues. I'm thankful that Andrew Garfield took this role. I really think his face will help bring people to the show. I genuinely dream of the day when my friends and family can break free of the programming they grew up in. And shows like Under the Banner of Heaven bring that reality a little bit closer every day. I could talk for hours more about this topic and honestly give other characters in this show an entire video. But I'm not gonna do that. I hope by now you can see why I find Andrew Garfield's role to be so important and impactful. It helps show a truth that once I was able to accept into my life, I was able to finally really live. If you're a member and you've watched all the way to the end, thank you. That was really brave of you. If you're happy in the church, then great. But if you're not happy in the church, I promise you there's a brighter future out there for you. Thanks for watching. Give your friends head and have a great day.
Don't you worry, it'll be okay. Don't you worry, I'm gonna get paid. Don't you worry, it'll be okay. Don't you worry, okay.